Third Age. We begin by acknowledging that we are on Kaurna land, Kaurna country. They have been able to be custodians of this land for thousands of years, and we appreciate that we are on their land. Tonight, we have Bob Kempe. His great-grandfather actually founded the Hermansburg Mission up near Alice Springs. And Bob's been translating the diaries and the records, and we have been very much concerned in the last recent years with trying to come to terms with what has happened, the colonisation process, how we've been affected, and what's happened actually in those early missions. How do they understand the colonisation process? And was the Bible involved at all? And so we're working now, as you probably heard from last week if you were here, with Anne Patel Gray, about the whole question of how do we read with a decolonised mind? How do we decolonise the narratives of the Bible? And next week I'll be presenting a special presentation which will be going all the way to a conference in Bethlehem. I'll be filming it, so I'll try and be as articulate as possible. But you're welcome next week. But in the meantime, Bob Kempe is going to be able to help us to understand the role of the missions and their understanding of the situation when they were actually in the middle of an Aboriginal community. So Bob Kempe, welcome, welcome, welcome.
Thank you. Yes, I am the great-grandson of a missionary, and so this subject is very, very close to my heart. I'm a Lutheran pastor. I've been a Lutheran pastor for 60 years, and over those 60 years, the Aboriginal story that's been closest to my heart is the one that happened up in Hermansburg. Been a part of our family, part of our story. I also am an emeritus lecturer at Australian Lutheran College, and for 10 years when I was a lecturer at ALC, one of my roles was as the coordinator of the pastoral program for Aboriginal pastors throughout the whole Lutheran Church of Australia. And as Norm said, in the last 6 years, I've been working with a friend and colleague of mine, Vic Fitzner, on translating the reports that those first missionaries sent both back here to Adelaide and also to Germany between 1875 and 1892. So I've been very immersed in this whole question of the role of the Christian missionaries in what's happened with Aboriginal people here in Australia. In the last couple of weeks, I've also been very interested in what Stan Grant has had to say about the whites and their influence upon Aboriginal people. And you may have read this yourselves, an article he published on the ABC website a couple of weeks ago in relation to the death of the Queen and the coronation of Charles III. If you read it, it's an angry article. It's a bitter piece of writing, I believe. And it mocks what Grant calls the absurdity of the whole coronation spectacle. And it denounces the stolen land, the genocide, the brutality, and I'm quoting Stan here, the declaration of martial law on his people for whom the war has never ended. Where, Grant asks, is the ceasefire? Where is the treaty? And also, where is God? Is a very important question for Stan in this issue. As a Christian, he says, how do I take this whole thing seriously? Holy oil, consecration? Does God bless empire? There is more God in a ghost gun, in a riverbed, in the birdsong of my country. But this is monarchy that has always fashioned God in its image, that believed in the divine right of king, the doctrine of discovery that meant a land not occupied by a Christian monarch was free for the taking. Some have suggested that this coronation is a deeply religious ceremony. Imagine a Christ, a brown-skinned man of suffering and sorrows, a man under occupation, a man persecuted and murdered by empire, now invoked in a ceremony to crown a white king of empire. Is this my Christ? The Christ who promised to bring a sword against injustice? The Christ who told us, what you do to the least of these, you do to me? The Christ who cried out why God had forsaken him? In the same week that, sorry Fergus, I lost my, it would be helpful I suppose if I did that. In the same week that Stan published that article, he also put out a book entitled The Queen is Dead. And I was so interested in what Stan had to say about all this, I bought a copy for myself. And this book expounds on that article that you had in the ABC website in relation to the abominations that the whites have inflicted upon the Aboriginal people. It's probably one of the angriest books I have ever read in my life. You've asked me tonight to speak about the legacy of Christian missionaries in their work amongst Aboriginal people. I've no doubt whatsoever there would be those, and probably Stan amongst them, who would lump Christian missionaries amongst the whites who have done this to the Aboriginal people in Australia, that he would put them in the same basket as all British colonialists, and who would decry as the legacy of these missionaries the oppression, the persecution, the murder, and the intended annihilation of a whole people, and what's more, all in the name of God. Now, there's no way in a presentation in what I have here this evening that I'm going to be able to address this particular topic in any great depth or with any great expertise. I don't know who could. Maybe perhaps John Harris, who come across his book called One Blood, which is an attempt by John Harris to describe for us 200 years of Aboriginal encounter with Christianity. And strangely, he calls it a story of hope. And yet, in this book, Harris doesn't either sort of back off from describing all the things about Christian missionaries in Australia that were not at all for the good of the Aboriginal people. I can't do tonight what John Harris has done. What I can do tonight is to tell you a little bit about my story, about my connection with Aboriginal people, and about the things that I have learned, particularly in just one little part of the missionary work amongst Aboriginal people, and that is in Hermannsburg. I feel a little bit uncomfortable about all this because my great-grandfather was a missionary. And I trust you to appreciate that there's a personal element in all this, in this whole topic. It touches on some rather sensitive spots. How do I deal with that? One of my big questions in getting involved in this whole thing has been, what kind of a man was my great-grandfather? What does that say about me? It becomes a quite personal journey, this whole thing. Let me tell you a little bit about him. That's him, as a young man with the woman he became engaged to. He was born and grew up in Germany. He's a German. He comes from around Leipzig area. And in his youth, he was quite a wild young lad. He trained to be a blacksmith, and that was his occupation. He began life as a Christian, as a Lutheran. He drifted from the faith, like many people do, but came back to it later in life, and decided he wanted to become a missionary. And so he trained at the Hermannsburg Mission Institute in Hermannsburg in Germany, and decided to become a missionary. That's he and my great-grandmother on the day of their engagement, or at the time they were engaged. And so he came out here to Australia as a mission on behalf of the Hermannsburg mission in Germany. He came out here, now this is as an older man, but he's on the right, that's my great-grandfather, that's an older man. On the left-hand side, one of his classmates, a guy called Wilhelm Schwarz, who came out also with him in 1875 here to Australia as a missionary being sent to Hermannsburg. And their story of coming out here and going up to Hermannsburg is an absolutely incredible story. He comes out here as this young man, he can be sent up to the centre. The Lutheran Church in South Australia had been granted 2,000 square miles of land up in the centre in the Fink River area to do mission work. And he and Schwartz travelled up to Hermannsburg with 3,000 sheep, a few hundred cattle and horses, and some chooks and a rooster. And they're going to found this mission up on the Fink River in Hermannsburg for the Lutheran Church. Now there's a whole story behind this, as I said, which is absolutely fascinating. What they did was remarkable. It was one of the epic stories, I think, of working in the founding of South Australia and the Northern Territory. They were assisted on the right-hand side there by the pastor who was the superintendent for Aboriginal missions for the Lutheran Church in South Australia back in 1875. He was a man by the name of Heidenreich, Pastor Heidenreich, who was a pastor up in Bethany. And things always didn't go well between him and the missionaries. And one of the fascinating stories is about the way in which they didn't always get along. And I suppose I could tell you something that we found out from our translation work as we've been going along. My great-grandfather at one stage along the line actually threatened to shoot Heidenreich because of the way in which he was not respecting what the missionaries were doing. So as I said, it's a fascinating story. But these are the four men together then with their spouses. My great-grandmother came out a couple of years later. And then also with lay people who helped them, 3 or 4 of those who helped them to set things up in Hermannsburg. These are the people who established Hermannsburg on the Fink, up in the Northern Territory. How many of you have been to Hermannsburg? A few of you. How do you know this place? Yeah. Anyway, they were the ones who occupied this. Now, these are the people that will say, some will say, stole the land from the Aboriginal people. These are the people, some will say, who colonised the land, who ruined the land, and who destroyed the culture of the Aboriginal people, the Aranda people in that area at that time, in Nataria as it's called. And these are the people who would destroy even the Aranda people. That's what some people will say. And also, they will say that these people did that in the name of God. Even worse, they did this often in the conviction that God had specifically given them this land. It was a divine gift, it was a covenant, and it was a covenant to the exclusion of any original inhabitants who might happen to be there. That's what some people will say about these people. This is the point at which I'd like to pause for a moment to reflect on this particular claim and also to begin to articulate what actually was the legacy of these particular missionaries. And in doing this, I don't want to become overly sensitive and defensive, because that can easily happen. But I believe that as much as we possibly can, we need to be realistic. This is about truth-telling, about what happened when white met black in places like Hermannsburg. And I believe we need to be balanced and fair in our dialogue as we seek to come to a mutual appreciation of what is now, after all, a shared story. The Hermannsburg story may have begun that way, but today the Hermannsburg story is very much a shared story. Like it or not, in a place like Hermannsburg, our two stories, the Aboriginal story and the missionaries and the white story, have come together. And at times those stories collide and they divide. At other times they blend and merge. And then at other times they emerge with a new story. So then, there can be no doubt that the missionaries did have a negative effect on the Aranda people. And this particular slide shows the extent of what's happened up in the Hermannsburg area since the missionaries came. Is that clear? Okay.
Bit foggy. Bit foggy.
Yeah, sorry about that. I can't do a thing about it. But what started as just a mission around Hermannsburg, can you see Hermannsburg up there? Yeah. Has expanded in the last 150 years to become what's called the Fink River Mission. And the Fink River Mission occupies an area today of about the equivalent of Victoria, the state of Victoria. It's a huge area, the Fink River Mission, and it takes in 5 language groups. It started with the Aranda people in the Hermannsburg area. It expanded out from there to include the Pitjantjatjara people to the south of Hermannsburg, to the Loricha people up to the north and to the west, and I can't pronounce the other two probably, but the Alyawara and Amajiri people as far as I can pronounce it. But there's 5 language groups that now make up the Fink River Mission. And last I heard there's something like 7,000 Aboriginal people in that area who would classify themselves as being Lutheran. So this is the area that we're talking about. And as the mission has been established and as it's grown, there can be no doubt about the fact that there has been a negative impact on the Aranda people. At one point in the writings of my great-grandfather, he actually says, "We invaded your land." He actually says that. "We invaded your land. We are intruders in your land." So the first missionaries did acknowledge that they took the land over. And in the process they do acknowledge that they destroyed much of the land itself. They've got 3,000-4,000 sheep, they've got all these cattle. Of course they're going to destroy the grasses and the bushes and the trees, and especially the water holes upon which the Aboriginal people of the land depended for their food and their sustenance. They did that. They did introduce the evils of Western civilization like typhus and measles and syphilis and other diseases. The missionaries didn't do that, but the white people in that area, they did. They did view the Aboriginal people, as they describe them, as sunken heathen. That's how my great-grandfather describes them over and over again. They were, in a sense, colonialists of the first order. And that, more of a similar nature, is true. And in those areas, the legacy of also the Hermannsburg missionary is shameful. There have been times when Vic Fisser and I have been working on these reports of the missionaries when I've cried. Because the way in which they talk about the Aboriginal people really is horrible. And we've gotten to the stage in my work where we want to publish these reports. We've gotten to our stage in our work where at times I said to Vic, I don't want to publish this. I want even to destroy these parts of our translation. They're shameful. However, we decided not to do this because to destroy things like this would be to destroy the truth. We cannot and ought not to deny what actually did happen. And as painful as it may be at times to speak about it, it is critical for our understanding of each other that we seek to say what was as truthfully and objectively as possible. And so the bad, sad, ignominious stuff stays. And Stan Grant can be as angry as he rightfully needs to be about the things that have happened. That's the bad legacy of the missionaries, also in Hermannsburg. But I believe there's also a good legacy. And as much as we might decry the bad, I trust we're able also to celebrate the good, because there is in the good hope. Incidentally, that's a picture of the Hermannsburg Mission Institute in Hermannsburg, where my great-grandfather did his training. Now, When we come to start trying to make some sort of a, I hope, objective and real assessment of these missionaries, and before we get on to discussing what their legacy might have been, I think it's important to note a couple of things about them. The first thing, the Hermannsburg missionaries were German. They weren't British, they were German. And that's really, really important, because they never saw themselves, and this is where apart from Stan Grant's thing, they never saw themselves or decided to be any part of any great British plan to colonise this country. That was never, ever a part of their agenda. Other people did, the pastoralists and other missionaries did, but not the Hermannsburg missionaries. And nor did they ever view the land on which they settled up there in Hermannsburg as some kind of covenant gift that God had given them to own and to develop by divine right for their own personal enrichment and advancement. They never saw the land up there as being that, as others may have in other parts, both of Australia and the rest of the world. For the Hermannsburg Lutheran missionaries, the land up there was a gift from God insofar as it was a place leased to them. They had a lease where they might undertake their mission work. For sure, they brought up their sheep and their cattle and their chooks, their wheat and their barley seed, their fruit trees and their vegetable seeds, and they sought to cultivate the land and grow their crops, but purely for the purposes of sustaining themselves and the mission station. They desired to be self-sufficient. That was their desire when they went up there, and to build a community around their station that would support the mission. And a very important part of that building of that commission and that mission and that station was that the Aboriginal people would be a part of that. Now, they go up there with their German, Western views on this, but they imagine this station as being a place where the Aboriginal people would share in the work, they would produce the things that were going to happen up there, and that they would benefit from this sustaining community. That this was the naive, but nevertheless the real thought that they had as they went up there. Paul Albrecht, and some of you may know, a missionary up there for many, many years, talks about the land on which the whites established their mission as land lent to the mission only for the time it took for the mission to be established. And once the mission believed that that point had been reached, he set about the unique task of returning that land to the Aboriginal people. And this happened between 1972 and 82, and it was the first time in Australia where a mission returned the land to the Aboriginal people in a very long and protracted kind of an undertaking. And so now that land which the mission had has been handed back to the Aranda people and to all the peoples in the Finke River Mission. And there's a whole story around that, which is quite fascinating too. Thus, in terms of the land, the Hermannsburg missionaries have always respected the land as under the custodianship of the Aboriginal people. And even if not always perfectly, they've done their best to ensure that the Aboriginal people in their area maintain the land and are regarded and encouraged as custodians of that land. And when pastoralists and others sought to remove Aboriginal people from their land, to take their land from them, those same missionaries advocated for and stood alongside the Aboriginal people as they fought to retain the custodianship of their land. And if any of you know Erionga, do you, up past Hermannsburg, the settlement of Erionga was a place that was especially set up for Aboriginal people who were being displaced from their land by the pastoralists. The fact that the Aboriginal people in the Finke River Mission are today able to name and claim this land as their land is, I think, a fantastic legacy to the whole mission up there. So that's the first thing. They were German, and the land was for them as a gift. They had no intention of colonising the land, as perhaps the British and the whites did. Second thing is, they're Lutheran. And being Lutheran is another of the legacies of those first missionaries. And the important thing about them being Lutheran is this, that their reasons for going up there were religious, not colonial. And that's really important, I think. The first Lutherans who came out here to Australia, and they first settled here in South Australia, came out here for religious reasons. They did not come out here to colonise this country. They came out because they themselves were refugees from religious persecution in their own country. And they established their churches here in South Australia. They built their churches, and then they spread from there. And as a part of the work that the Lutherans here in Australia undertook when they first arrived here, they decided that they would also like to engage in mission work. And that's where it's important to understand the mindset of these German Lutheran missionaries, which was in fact the mindset of much of Western Christianity at that time. You know, we put this whole issue of missionary activity into its wider context. We need to remember, I think, that at the time the missionaries came to Australia and to Hermannsburg, all missionaries, others were scattering all over the world in their mission activity. A man called Timothy Tennant, who's written a book on the invitation to world missions, says that between 1792 and 1910, we experienced the great century of missions around the world, not just here in Australia. During that time, he said, which is roughly coterminous with the 19th century, more new Christians emerged from a wider number of new people groups than at any previous time in the history of the church. Never before had so many Christians moved to so many vast and remote parts of the globe and communicated the gospel across so many cultural boundaries. It was the age of mission around the world. And so it's no historical surprise when Kempe and Schwartz and their chooks and their sheep and all that turn up that one day in June 1877 on the banks of the Fink in Central Australia. There were all sorts of mixed and various motives for these missionaries in coming out here. For many, particularly the British, it was very much tied up with the glory of the home country in conquering new lands in the name of God, even subjugating poor heathen people under cross and country for the gaining of wealth and goods. And that's the British missionaries. But I don't believe that's what it was for the Hermannsburg missionaries. In Lutheran theology, it's about religion, it's about faith. And at the heart of mission work in all Lutheran theology is this belief, and you and I may not agree with this, but that's the way it was for them, this belief that there is only one way to experience the life with God. And that one way is only through Jesus Christ. And that anybody, it doesn't matter who it is, whether it's Aboriginal people in Australia or people in Africa or white people in the middle of London, anybody who does not know Christ, according to traditional Lutheran theology, is outside the kingdom of God. And mission work is all about telling people the good news of Jesus so that they might come into the family of God and this way know the eternal life that God has for them. Race and colour and language have nothing to do with it. Being heathen, and they called them heathen, as Paul in the New Testament talks about the Gentiles, the non-Jews, is descriptive of anyone who is outside the pale of God's forgiveness in New Testament terms in Christ, regardless of race, colour or language. Furthermore, again in Lutheran theology, Christ is for everyone, and Christians will convert anyone, win them over for Christ, as they say. And this alone is what I believe drove those first missionaries to Hermannsburg. And throughout the letters and reports, there are hundreds of examples of the missionaries yearning for the Aboriginal people to be graced through Christ, and of their heartbreak when they did not happen. Their mission was a purely religious one. It was not colonial. And that's a really important thing, I think, to remember about. We may not agree with it, but that's the way it was. Okay. I'd like to come and, well, what was their legacy then? Before we do that, I would like you to hear what the Aboriginal people in Hermannsburg say the legacy of these missionaries was. This is a 7-minute clip, I hope we have time for this, taken from Backroads, the program on the ABC called Backroads, which a few years ago had a program devoted to Hermannsburg. And I was able to procure a copy of this program, and I've edited out 7 minutes of Aranda people talking about what they believe the legacy of the Hermannsburg missionaries is. I'd like you to listen to this now before I summarise everything in my own way. It's lovely to hear that from the voice of one of their own people. So I'd just like to finish by what is the legacy of the Lutheran missionaries in Hermannsburg, and what might we learn from that as we seek to engage more and more effectively with our Aboriginal brothers and sisters around the whole country. And this, I believe, is the legacy. The thing about the missionaries is that they went. They desired to connect with the Aboriginal people, and they desired to develop a living connection with them. They went to the centre of Australia, and they connected with the people up there. And, we may not always like the way they did it, but this was their desire to connect with them. And I believe this is so important still today, that we now learn how to connect with our Aboriginal brothers and sisters where they are. I have a bit of a thing about people who do this from their bureaucratic offices and their academic hideaways. Stan Grant himself even talks about the fact how many of these people who talk about Aboriginal issues these days have actually talked to an Aboriginal person. They did. Secondly, the thing they did was to preserve the language. The first thing my great-grandfather did when he got up there after they took care of their chooks and their sheep was to sit down and actually talk with the Aboriginal people, and they wanted to learn their language. The first thing he did was to produce a dictionary. The second thing he did was to produce a grammar of the Aranda language. And as you heard on the film, the next thing they did was to start translating. Now, fair enough, it was scripture, it was hymns and all that, but translating them into the Aranda language. And then as Hermannsburg spread and the Finke River took over these other language groups, they preserved the languages in all those other areas as well. And they sought to talk with the Aboriginal people in their language. And that's so important. I remember sitting with a group of Pitjantjatjara people over at Yalata, which is a part also of Finke River these days, about the importance of language for them. English for them is the commercial language. That's how you learn to get your sit-down money and all that sort of stuff. Their own language is their soul language. And what the missionaries have done, I think, is to help them to preserve their soul language in all sorts of ways. The third thing that they did, was not only to learn the language and speak the language, but to teach the language. And for the first missionaries up there, education was an incredibly important part of what they did. The first thing they did was to build a chook house. The second thing they did was to build a church. But the important thing about that church was that only 1/3 of the building, in that original building, was the church. 2/3 of it was a school. They started a school. And they taught the Aboriginal people, not just the stuff they wanted to teach them about Christianity, but they taught them geography, they taught them maths, they taught them things like this as well. Education was a very important thing that they did, and still is today. The Lutheran Church up there has colleges and schools where education for Aboriginal people is a really important part of what we do, and it's an education where the curriculum is very much geared to what's important for Aboriginal people, not necessarily for white people. Through the language and the teaching of language and education, they also help to safeguard the culture. And you heard Warren talk about that on the video. It took them a little while to get there, I have to admit this. When the missionaries got up there first, they were puzzled by what they saw with the Aboriginal people. They were critical of what they saw in terms of Aboriginal culture. And yes, they did try in many cases to get rid of the children's and the ceremonies and things like that were a part of their culture. They did do that. But gradually they learned to appreciate more and more what the Aboriginal culture was. And one of the most remarkable things in the translation work that we have done is a report that my great-grandfather put out about 3 years after he had been there, where in about 30 or 40 pages he describes what they saw as being the culture of the Aboriginal people. They were interested. They were really interested in connecting what their culture was, and despite all the biases they had in terms of these people being sunken heathens and everything, they had a really deep respect for the Aboriginal people and for their culture. And they sought to preserve that culture as much as they could in their time within their Christian framework. Of course, as you also heard in the video, as time went on, and people like the Australians later on, their understanding and appreciation of the culture really expanded. And if you ever get up to Alice Springs, to the Australia Centre, you'll see how up there they really still today working hard to preserve the culture of the Aboriginal people. They not only did all that, they not only brought the faith up there in terms of a priest faith, it was also a very much lived faith. And they were very intent on wanting to inculcate within the Aboriginal people values, not to say that they didn't have values, but had values that were very consistent with, for the missionaries, their Christian values. Now they sought to do this in ordinary everyday lives of the people, in the way they related to each other. For example, the Aboriginal people, their very family is really important for them, and that sort of ties in as a value very much with the Christian missionaries also. But for the missionaries, this thing of the importance of family has this very important outcome, I think. There was no stolen generation in Fig River Mission. There's not one stolen child in this mission. And on the contrary, the encouragement for families to be families and to grow as family is very much an important part of what they have done. But they also alert to the implications of the living faith in bigger issues, such as the sexual immorality and exploitation of Aboriginal women and girls by the whites. The missionaries spoke out against that, the way that particularly the girls and the women were exploited by the whites. The missionaries were opposed to any kind of violence. They were opposed to it whether it was between different groups of Aboriginal people. And I don't think we should ever neglect this. I remember someone telling me once, one thing the first missionaries were a little bit blind to was how much violence there actually is between the Aboriginal people themselves. And the missionaries were opposed to that. But they were equally opposed to any violence on the part of whites towards the Aboriginal people, and also particularly where the pastoralists and the police stepped in, and you have these terrible massacres going on up in that particular part. Yeah, the missionaries were absolutely opposed to this. They spoke out against the massacres. They were instrumental, for example, in getting the infamous Constable Wilshire, if you know the Wilshire story. They were instrumental in having him arrested and charged and brought to trial because he murdered Aboriginal people. They made Hermannsburg a place of protection and sanctuary for Aboriginal people under the threat of slaughter by the whites. As time went on and the mission developed, they also then wanted to have the Aboriginal people to be autonomous in terms of how they understood and practiced church. And so the missions up there undertook the training for Christian mission up there. And this is something that I was very much involved with in my days at the seminary, where we set up a curriculum for the training of Aboriginal pastors that was sympathetic and incorporated the whole of Aboriginal understanding of things, where Aboriginal men, it's always men up there still, were mentored by others into it, where we started this thing called the Sem in the Bush, where we would go, and we still go up there, and where we spend a week or 2 weeks actually sitting in the bush and doing theological education, and one of the greater experiences of my life. And finally, what we the legacy of the missions up there is the Christian gospel. Now, there are those who might lament this, that the gospel was the gospel of Jesus Christ was brought up there and proclaimed, and we see this as being a legacy, because in the process people will say we destroyed the spirituality of the Aboriginal people there. Now we could talk for hours about this, but I believe we have to face this, that this is one of our legacies, whether we like it or not. We went up there and we took them the gospel of Jesus. And I believe it's a very, very positive legacy, and would you believe Stan Grant does too. It's been fascinating to see what the Aboriginal people up there have done, and I'm sure in other parts of Australia, with what we took there in terms of the word. One of my experiences up there, when we got to the stage where we were ordaining Aboriginal pastors into the church, was to examine the candidates for ordination. And it's fascinating to sit down with them after they've been through their studying and their thinking and their talking, to have them feed back to us what they have done with the gospel and what they have done with the word. And they have taken it, and they have filtered it, and they have adapted it, and they have changed it in a way that makes it living and real for them in a new and different way. It is fascinating to sit with the Aboriginal pastors and hear them tell me what the Christian faith is for them. It'll be different from you and me, but it fits who they are and where they are. Anyway, my first time I went to Hermansburg was 40 odd years ago, and it was quite an experience to go up there. And on the Sunday that I was up there, I went to church, in that church that you saw on there just before. And at the end of the service, the pastor, John Fisner, in those days, introduced me to the congregation as Ngara Kempe, the great-grandson of the first missionary who was up there. And I was amazed after the service how many of the Aboriginal people came up to me. And said, "Thank you. Thank you for your great-grandfather who taught us about Jesus." And I can just come back to Stan, if I give you this, I'm sorry, I'm going over time. For Stan, this is the place where we can meet. If I can just quote him a little bit in the finish. He says that it's only in the Christian gospel he believes that there is hope. And the hope, he says, between the relationships to do with the whites and the Aboriginal people is in terms of love. And the love that we know through the gift of Christ to the world, and the love he sees particularly in it's interesting, the theology of the cross. It is in the theology of suffering and shame and death where whites and Aboriginal can connect and reconcile. Now that sounds very Christian to me, but to Stan it also sounds very Aboriginal. Thank you.
Thank you. Now we'll have a few questions, and somebody's got a mic. There we are. Who would like to throw a question?
Thank you very much, Bob. I found that a really moving presentation, and I believe quite balanced. And not only Stan Grant, but Noel Pearson. 2 nights ago, over 1,000 people were in the town hall, and he almost went to pains to connect with the Lutheran mission and the missionaries trained here in Adelaide, who were the missionaries obviously at Hopevale. And he did nothing but, in one sense, praise or give thanks for that legacy and what it has meant to him. And I kind of wonder whether, when you talk, he clearly is a person who has a great grasp of the Western Enlightenment and all that. I mean, I don't know whether that came from the Lutheran missionaries as well, but I thought it was very interesting that he, as well as Stan Grant, have that legacy. I know I have known a little bit about the Finland mission, and what amazed me are the number of, and maybe you can bring us up to date, of pastors who are trained, and everybody does their worship in their own language. I don't know that there's anywhere else in Australia quite like that. It certainly doesn't exist in the Narnam land, of which I'm acquainted with, but I think it's quite unique. But I do have a question, and I know you might have touched on it a bit at the end, and that was, over the years, you've got Aboriginal culture, spirituality, grounded in the land. You've got Western Christianity grounded in the Word and event-based theology. How much interplay has there emerged between the two? It's a bit like, I think you hinted at it, that, you know, there's that adaptation you said in the last point there. But I always got the impression with Australians, it was almost a bit like, there's Christianity over there, there's Aboriginal culture over there, and it's like the Lutheran two spheres. But I just wondered how, you know, in these times, what has been the kind of the impact of the two faiths on each other.
And I don't know how well I can answer that one. Well, I've got to be careful. I think the Aboriginal people keep a lot of what they do secret, so I've got to be careful. I think they do all sorts of things with the Christian faith in relation to the intermarrying of that with their own spirituality that they do in their own business. They do that themselves in their own and with their own people. And then when we come along and ask them, tell us what you've done, they won't. And I can understand that. Yeah. They want to be seen to be doing the right thing. But I know people who have worked more closely with the Aboriginal people than I have. People like Paul Albrecht and the linguists up there who have a far better understanding of that than I do. And I would love to know more about that, because I think it's just absolutely fascinating for the Aboriginal people and for us. Yeah. Gives us a whole different appreciation of our Christian faith. Yeah. And I think Norm's going to touch on this, you know, the whole thing of land, for example, the way they understand land, and the way we Christians talk about land, often are seen as being opposed to each other, but they're not. And the Aboriginal people are able to take that, and they can absorb Genesis and the whole thing about land into their teaching of land in a way that gives you a whole new meaning to what Genesis is. That's your thing next week, isn't it? Yeah.
Can I just ask, Strelo, as I understand it, Strelo became initiated?
Yeah, well, I think so.
Yeah,
yes.
It's an Aboriginal group, yeah.
So do some of the others.
Missionaries, yeah.
I have a kinship with the Aranda people. I don't know whether it is, but somewhere the Kempes are linked in with their kinship stuff.
Yeah. Next question.
Thank you. I think it would be interesting to work on the similarities between what happened in other centres in South Australia in the 19th century, because the Uniting Church, for example, has the diaries of George Taplin, and he was the founder of the mission at Port Macleay, and for about 20 years. And a lot of the things in his diary reflect what you said. There's a lot of commonality there, I think, in terms of the issues and relationships, particularly the struggle we had with pastoralists. He was the missionary of the Aborigines Friends Association, and then, of course, later on, the Presbyterians went to up north as well. So you've got think some pretty interesting comparisons, or similar, looking for comparisons in terms of how missionaries worked in that period. As a matter of interest, I've been a part of a group that's formed a new organisation called the South Australian Church Historians Network, and we're planning a conference next year on the 4th of May during History Festival Month, and we're open, the conference will be an all-day session, and we're open to presentations of particularly the effect of colonisation in the 19th century and how South Australia was different from the other colonial settlements as the paradise of descent. So it's a bit, I think the topic is something like revisiting the paradise of descent, but it would be pretty interesting, I think, to have 4 or 5 examples of missionary work that was done in Indigenous communities across the state as a way of drawing some comparisons and finding some similarities.
Yep. And I hope I focused on Hermannsburg, and I hope you don't hear that I'm saying that Hermannsburg was the only place where these kind of wondrous things happen. I think missionaries across the board have got a bit of a bad rap over the last 150 years, and we weren't as bad as people sometimes thought, right across the board. And this is where this book by John Harris, I think, is really, really valuable in giving the big picture right across the board.
Okay, well here, thank you.
I don't know if you've seen, there's been a film on the Hermannsburg Choir, the women's choir that went to Germany.
Oh yeah.
And they sang there, and they sang in their own language some of the very old music that came from Germany, the hymns that came from Germany, and it was very well received.
Yes. Yep. I followed that very, very closely.
It's beautiful.
And
Beautiful.
and yes.
And just one small tale, I worked up in the AQI lands for a couple of years, and one day we're out with the school kids and things, and the elders were sitting around this fire, and we were trying to make spears. So we had to straighten the wood by putting it in the flames, and I didn't want to burn it, so I wasn't doing it correctly. So the elder grabbed it from me and put it down properly in the flames, and then we made this spear. But he also told me that he had a wound on his thigh where he'd been speared as part of the local law. And he said the next day he went and speared the guy who'd speared him in the thigh as well. But unfortunately hit an artery and the other guy died. So, and he was quite, sort of sad about that, but it was part of their legal way of doing things.
That's their payback system. Yes. Which of course the missionaries tried to help or wanted to get them to change.
My stories are somewhat similar to the story you've told here, that my parents were missionaries up at Kanmanya Presbyterian Mission, which was established by R.B. Love at the very beginning, at the same time probably as Hermannsburg was, I'm not sure what one thing. But there was a lot of respect amongst both the tribes and the missionaries, and it still exists today. So I was up there as a child until I was 4, and my maiden aunt went up later, and it was a time when they were wanting to take the children away. So the Aboriginal people came up to my maiden aunt, who was very prim and proper Presbyterian lady from Melbourne, and said, would she adopt this girl because she would be taken away otherwise. So my aunt took her to Melbourne, enrolled her in Presbyterian Ladies College. She's got degrees, she's travelled around the world, she's at universities speaking about the two cultures. So there's been a lot of that nice intermixing, and we're still friends today. So that's been a nice similar story about respect for both cultures and maintaining them.
Thank you.
One final question here, Bob, Norm.
Yeah.
Bob, you said earlier in your presentation, and was on one of the slides, the motivation of the missionaries was religious, not colonial. But as I'm sure you know, the word colonising or colonisation or colonialism has a newer sort of different, more contemporary meaning these days, not just colonising the land physically, but colonising the mind, colonising the human consciousness, colonising culture. Now I reckon that's that second meaning is what Norm will be speaking about next week when he's talking about decolonising Genesis. The missionaries mightn't have been colonising in the first sense. Physically, they weren't British, they were German, but they weren't following that physical colonisation path. But were they colonising in the second sense? In other words, were they colonising the Aboriginal mind for Jesus? Comment.
Yeah, they were. Yeah. But I would say that their reasons for doing that were, again, religious. Yeah, they did. I have no
Nothing
qualms
political
with
power.
that. Yes.
And could it have been any other way?
For them,
Well, yes.
yes,
For any of the missionaries.
yes,
Yeah.
yes, that's right. So that's true. I agree with that.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so therefore, was it wrong in the same sense that the first sort of colonisation was wrong? Do you think?
Yeah, well, that's a very, very good question. And a Christian would say, no, never. Because the most important thing in the world is that somebody knows Jesus. There's nothing more important than that. That can never be wrong. Yeah. Which I believe, I'm going to be careful. As a Christian, I believe that too. But it's what people do with that message. Who Jesus is for us. I think that's one of the most exciting questions in the world.
Yeah.
And what we do with that. And you know, the Jesus I believed in as a child is not the Jesus I believe in now.
I think it's just about time to have a coffee.
Yes, Dawn, but we do have an important announcement to make.
Please make it.
You've got a little leaflet here on your seats, and it's about what's happening at United Church on Sunday afternoon. And one of the features is the legacy of the Lutheran missionaries. Gerhard Rudiger, who is a German, he's only been in Australia for about the last 15 or 20 years, he is one of those that was a prime mover in being able to recover the Ghana language. And it's because of the work of the German missionaries, who I believe not just annotated the language into terms of the Latin script, but also ours to be pronounced the phonetics. And that's one of the reasons why the Ghana is one of the 4 languages in the world which has died, at least died as being a living language, that's been able to come back and actually become a real living language again. So I commend, perhaps at only between 2, at least Gerhard will be on early in the program, this goes from 2 to 4. Gerhard Rudiger tells the story of the recovery of the living language of the Ghana, the First Nations people, from the records of the early German missionaries. Also, Elijah Bravington, who was a younger signatory of the Uluru Statement, will be there and talking about the voice. And we have an ongoing display of the Ghana footprint in the plains of Adelaide, particularly the municipality of Unley. So I'd like to commend that program to you as well. And of course, it was Bonhoeffer said, the question is, who is Jesus Christ for us today?
Yeah. Gerhard Rudiger, by the way, he talked about the songkeepers. Gerhard Rudiger went on that trip to Hermannsburg with the songkeepers.
Thank you very much indeed. Another word of applause. You're invited to come again next week by an old bloke called Harville.
Uncle Norm.
Uncle Norm, and we're going to talk about how you decolonise. Anne Patel Gray said, "The gospel has liberated me to reinterpret the Bible from the cultural perspective of her Aboriginal people." And next week, we will decolonise the first chapters of Genesis.